it's true with any technology. The more complicated it gets, the more opaque it is, the less agency we have in using it. At the time, I didn't really think the two things really were related, studying literature and computer science and software engineering. But nowadays, I think they're totally related. And what I do is something at the intersection of those two fields. I would say creativity is a human term. So what creativity means for machines is probably something entirely different, right?
Hello and welcome to the Teens in AI podcast. My name is Alice, and in today's episode, in celebration of World Book Day, my co-host Kate and I were joined by Dennis Tenen, Associate Professor of Comparative Literature at Columbia, to discuss the future of text and technology. We hope you enjoy. So I was thinking to start off, we'd love to know how you ended up interested in this field and the work you do in it today.
As an undergraduate, my degree was in comparative literature, but starting from high school and in college, I was working first as a web designer back in the 90s, and then as a programmer. And so when I finished college, I had a pretty good resume in tech, and I ended up working for Microsoft. And after working at Microsoft for a while, after being in Silicon Valley, I went and got my PhD, again in comparative literature. And at the time, I didn't really think the two things really were related, studying literature and computer science and software engineering. But nowadays, I think they're totally related. And what I do is something at the intersection of those two fields.
I can imagine that the world of Silicon Valley and the world of academic comparison were once thought to be very, very separate. But actually, is there a relationship between writing and technology that's can be traced quite far back in history?
Well, I think so. And this intersection happens in several ways, right? So first of all, writing is a type of a technology, right? So just being able to write something, to store it, to retrieve it later, is a type of it. Now, today, it seems normal to us and kind of regular. But you can imagine that the invention of writing really, changed the world in some way. There's this dialogue by Plato, Phaedrus, where Socrates is talking to a friend of his, to a student of his, and he's really worried about how writing is going to change the way we think, and we're going to start not using our natural memory and forgetting stuff because we're so reliant on this crazy thing called writing. So technology and writing are related. Writing as a technology, a book is kind of a hardware, right? But the software of writing, the algorithm of how you write a poem, how you write a sentence, how do you write in a particular style. So that idea that writing follows certain templates, that also goes back to historical sources. What I'm interested in partly in my work is how very early on, so for example, there was this 14th century Majorcan Spanish mystic who was interested in thinking about God, and he created these circles that had all the attributes of God, all the names of God, all the adjectives of God, and the verbs related to God. And then you would spin the circles. And by spinning the circles, you would create sentences that describe, right? So you can imagine kind of like a Mad Lib, ad lib kind of thing, right? So you have all the possible combinations of names, adjectives, and verbs. And that's a type of an algorithm. That's a type of a machine that generates, right? That generates, in this case, discourse about God. And there are many, many examples in that 13th, 14th century. There are many examples of similar sort of algorithms, similar software that powered literature. And I'm very interested in unearthing this history.
And, when we talk about a modern day computer, when do we start to see these kind of technologies first be able to write for themselves?
At what point does a machine begin to write for itself, right? So I'm not sure. So the kind of generation text generation mechanisms that I'm mentioning, they were quite common actually in the 18th century, in the 19th century, in the 20th century. So let me give you another example. Early Hollywood, people were interested in writing many, many scripts quickly so they can sell them. And they similarly had these books where you had like a list of characters and then a list of situations. And you can just sort of combine characters and situations to create movie plots very quickly and then maybe sell them. So that's, I would say, semi-autonomous writing, right? So the human is doing a part of the job, and then kind of like the machine or the algorithm, or in this case, this smart book, right, is doing a part of the thinking for the writer. Now, today, you can train a machine, you can train a computer to generate some text, right? But that training still requires human input. The desire to write, to put this machine into motion, whether it's a Hollywood script generating machine or a theological, medieval theological machine about God. So I guess there's a scale of autonomy, right? How autonomous something is. Is there a machine that's out there floating in the world, just generating texts on its own completely because it wants to do it? Probably not.
So I guess at the moment it's quite interesting because that relationship is, as you say, semi-autonomous. We still need the creativity of humans to create the stories. But I think, the one thing that makes humans feel superior to AI long term is their creativity. So is that a comfort blanket that in the long term they can afford to have? Or do you think that AI could eventually write empathetic, nuanced literature for itself?
Uh, that's, again, a hard question. So, wait, let me ask you an easier question. What if I asked you, will self-driving cars ever drive themselves somewhere? Will they have lunch dates and drive each other or whatever that is, right? It's kind of like, it's a weird question, right? Because self-driving cars today are much more autonomous than cars before, but yet they don't really have interests as such, right? That's the kind of question that, we're in sci-fi territory. Will machines have desires? Will they have, truly sort of, can they originate? Do they have agency? Do they have wills? Do they have wants? Do they want to express themselves? And I don't know the answer to that question. And maybe the key here is that whatever we mean by creativity today, and whatever we mean by having an interest in something, in the machine world, those are human terms. Machines are sort of much more alien than that, and those terms maybe look and feel very much different for a machine to have an interest.
But say that we're in a scenario whereby there is still a bit of a relationship between, humans still have a little bit of control over the machine and says to the machine, right, write a book.
Yeah.
And then theoretically, and into the ethics of this, if that robot or that machine then wrote an amazing book and it won a Nobel Prize, surely there's a human behind that robot, but the robot wrote the book, but the human created the machine. So who's giving the acceptance speech? Who is responsible?
Right, right, right. But same, think about this. Let's say if you were to write a poem and you were to write like like a sestina, like a very specific poem that has certain rules, and you follow the rules of the poem, do you ever credit the rules of a poem in your acceptance speech as a poet laureate? There are formal rules that govern our lives in a different way. There are definitely formal rules that govern the production of language, the way we speak, the way we write. You're looking at style guides, right? You're looking at how to properly, how to write a letter. Dear Dennis, dear Kate, dear Alice, right? Like it has to sincerely, there's all these kind of parts that we assemble together to write something. And a lot of these parts, I can't say that I invented this way of speaking. Like the way I write a letter follows a template, right? The template guides much of my creative decision. So if you can imagine a computer writing a best-selling or award-winning book, and the engineering team behind it, probably would have some great responsibility for the afterlives of that robot that they wrote. Um, so yeah, I'm sure that, well, it would be fun to think of a machine writing an acceptance speech as well.
And then moving over to something maybe a bit different into sort of journalism and the news, the topic of writing good news is very controversial right now, very relevant. And, fake news is very rife these days with social media. And, what do you think the future is of machine learning in journalism?
I can write a bot, right? And that bot it's going to be a Twitter bot. And I'll write a bot that every time there is a topic, it's going to kind of insert itself in a conversation and say something nice or say something mean, whatever. It's going to be a bot of this sort, right? So you can imagine a bunch of humans are talking, but every time you say something on a particular topic, this sort of robot interferes and inserts itself into a conversation, right? You can see how that could be socially disruptive, right? So this is what I mean by an algorithmic agent. It is so somebody coded a particular bot, right? And then the person is gone. The programmer is no longer there, but the bot continues to have this impact. And that's an interesting sort of thought experiment to think of. Okay, there's a room full of people talking and there is a bot responding to them, but what if there's a room of people and then there is even a larger room, 10 people are talking and 100 bots are inserting themselves on different topics, and they're inserting themselves in a way to maybe troll somebody, maybe bully somebody, maybe flatter somebody, maybe to sell you a product, right? Maybe to change your mind. And so the intrusion of algorithmic semi-autonomous agents into our social life, into our creative life, into our emotional life, that what impact that would have on society. And again, I don't know, but we can tell now that it could have a disruptive impact on society. It's not a technological question, it's more of a sociological question and a political question, right? So should we, for example, regulate the speech of bots? Should we limit their capacity to insert themselves into our conversations? I don't know, maybe. Now, of course, I've been mentioning kind of the agents that are maybe malicious or disruptive in some ways. Now, you can think of the opposite. So, for example, I have one project right now with Rishi Goyal, who is a emergency room physician, but also a literary scholar here at Columbia. And we are thinking about vaccine hesitancy, like the way people talk about vaccines and sometimes are skeptical about vaccines. And one thing we were thinking about is writing kind of a social media bot that will insert itself into a conversation in a very positive way. So for example, if somebody mentions some piece of misinformation about vaccines, our bot would come in and say something positive about vaccine, or say some fact about vaccines that maybe will change someone's mind. So we haven't done this yet. This is the kind of stuff we're brainstorming. But now I'm thinking, okay, there may be a way kind of for good actors to use autonomous algorithmic agents that are speaking, that are communicating, that are writing, right, in a way that actually maybe improves our collective discourse about something, in this case, about vaccines.
I think it's fascinating that in a world, say on Twitter, where we have, people who are positive contributors to the platform and people who are perhaps a little more negative, we could end up with kind of good bots and bad bots in that sense. And that makes me wonder what the legislation around this will be, because it definitely, from what you're saying about vaccines, sounds like, we absolutely shouldn't just cut all bots for sure. But how do you think that we legislate in order to maybe tell people when they're talking to a bot? Do they have to know? Do we create certain language, or are there barriers to what bots can and cannot participate in? How do we control the discussion? And is it our role to control this discussion?
I mean, honestly, I really don't know the answer to that question. And I think this is the kind of conversation that we all need to have between both the public, the audience, right, on social media. We need to get legislators involved in this conversation, technologists, social activists, and so on. I mean, I'm interested in having that conversation, though, there's so much involved here. Like, so some may say this is, free speech. You wrote the bot, and I can say, well, actually, no, it's Kate's bot. It's not the bot speaking. It's Kate speaking through the bot. Why should we legislate? You're a person. You just happen to have like a little companion, a little robot companion. Should we legislate? Are we limiting your freedom of speech or their freedom of speech? You can see how everything gets tangled quite quickly about who's responsible for this.
Yeah, totally. It's a whole, complicated situation, isn't it? It's very, very topical and ethical. It's so fascinating. But if there's one thing you wanted everyone to know about the relationship between literature and technology, what would you say that would be?
Just one thing. Can I take this question in a completely different direction? It is not the one thing I want, but it's more an example that I've been sort of really kind of blew my mind, and I'm struggling with it just recently. So machine learning, AI, what you can do is you can train a machine, you can train a robot based on something that's been written before. So for example, if you have a bunch of novels of a particular type or a bunch of Hollywood scripts, you can kind of teach the machine to generate more Hollywood scripts. Or if you have a bunch of novels, it will generate more novels in this particular style. So what I did to test this, what I did for one of my books, I fed the machine 4 chapters of my book, and it sort of generated the 5th chapter. And that chapter was pretty cool, even though it's dense academic kind of a thing. But I was on occasion surprised by the insight that I found there. I was like, yes, I did want to say something like that. Or yes, the previous 4 chapters do, like it tried to summarize the previous work. So we are now at a moment where machines can really pass the Turing test, right? They really can imitate writing and even create, to myself, unexpectedly creative piece of work. So on a smaller scale, you asked a very big question, like one big thing, but on a smaller scale, something we do at the university, at school all the time is we read the text together, right? Let's imagine the 3 of us. And then I'm like, I don't know, did Alice really understand this text? Are we even on the same page? And so I can ask you to like write a paper to kind of synthesize the material and maybe like think more deeply about a particular topic. And what I'm trying to gauge is that what is inside of your head? Did you truly understand the material that was presented to you in class, right? So students write papers all the time. Is that still the case, by the way, in school? I'm guessing yes, right? So papers are like a major educational tool. But we are now in a situation where you can take a bunch of papers on any topic, last minute perhaps. You didn't have time to write that term paper for your class, and you can just sort of feed in a bunch of papers and it will spit out something that sounds, I would say like maybe a B paper right now is very possible. If your teacher is not paying attention, they can read this paper and be like, all right. They read the material. They sort of got the right, on any topic. So what does this mean? That means as an instructor, right, as a college instructor, I have to reevaluate even the kind of, should I still assign papers? I don't even know anymore if I'm assigning papers. I'm certain that some portion of them will be written using an algorithm. So what does this, so here's a small way in my world, right, in the educational world, where the ability of computers to generate essays, it will have to change the way we do things in the university. And again, I think we're just beginning to understand kind of how, I think technology is quite far further ahead than people realize. So what will happen to college grading? What will happen to the paper? Maybe the student paper as we know it is a genre that we have to completely reevaluate. Like, will I have to sit there and just like, we only write essays in class? Or what happens if your writing software, and this is definitely, in the works, you probably, when you use Gmail, for example, is beginning to auto-complete your sentences. I don't know if you use that feature, but imagine that feature getting smarter, and sort of you begin a sentence and it auto-completes facts. It makes you kind of a much more eloquent writer. It gives you suggested follow-up sentences, right? What does that mean? Is that just the way, is that cheating in some way? Or is it just the way we write now with the aid of, there's this kind of assistance and smart technologies that are working in the background and constantly helping us, right, articulate ourselves better?
Definitely. And, I love it when Google predicts my emails. It's a great way
Yes.
to, as you say, eloquently present myself on email. And it is a functional tool. But if we're talking about fiction and mimicking style, could a bot write, say, another Harry Potter book that everyone's been waiting for, which writes in the style of J.K. Rowling? Could it introduce a new plot? Could this sort of tool function in fiction as well as non-fiction?
And then I guess when it does that, does that book belong to J.K. Rowling because he's taken all of her ideas and all her style? Or is it just like, well done, bot, like you've created a new bestseller?
Right. So you can see how, the question of originality there is very interesting. Though, again, J.K. Rowling, when she's writing, she's also emulating other authors and other, right, like people who came before her. Authors are constantly emulating and, right, expanding on other universes. So I don't know. Again, I think the question is, would you want to read it if you knew there are, 1,000 Harry Potters, 1,000 follow-ups, this like a whole universe of alternative worlds where Harry Potter continues to live. So what does it do to the audience? And, I'm not sure whether we'd be interested in reading fiction generated by computers.
I think it's really interesting in the way that actually, when it comes down to it, will humans continue to value each other more than machines? Or will we see ourselves on a par with that? And as I was talking to before about, creativity as a human comfort blanket. And there's a German artist, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's called Mario Klingerman. And he uses AI in his work and has won awards for it. And he says that humans aren't original, as you were saying, he says we only reinvent, we make connections between things we've seen, which, a bit like J.K. Rowling, perhaps, using connections between other writers that she's heard of before. So I guess what I'm asking is he says, humans can only build on what we've heard and learned and others have done before us, but machines can create from scratch. Can machines be more creative than us? Is that something you would agree with?
Well, it's again this question of creativity. I would say creativity is a human term. So what creativity means for machines is probably something entirely different, right? And that word creativity has a history of its own, and we have a bunch of intuitions around that word, but I would say they're intuitions about humans. They're not intuitions about machines. So I know it's not a satisfying answer, but that's okay. Let me give you an analogy, maybe a simpler analogy. It's like you can make a poetry bot that just constantly makes poems. It will within minutes drown you. It will drown your audience in poetry. But it's machine poetry. It's generated by a machine. Once you know that it's generated by an algorithm, do you as an audience, as a reader, do you lose interest in the production? Are you still interested in watching kind of humans not compete but sort of display their creativity, and knowing that it came from a fellow human being, knowing that their creativity came from a particular time and place, from a particular body, from a particular embodied experience, right? The connection of the word to the person. We still watch, I watch chess on YouTube, even though like computers can beat humans in chess. I'm not watching computers compete with each other. Like that's more boring. I like to watch, I like the personalities of the chess world. I like the commentary. They're all kind of human things. And I suspect something similar will remain in the world of letters. We will continue to read each other's, I will read your short stories and your poems and your novels, because I'm interested in you in some way as a human. And, maybe when I see, machine poetry, it's a little bit of another sort of, it's another genre. It's another type of output that I encounter in a very different way.
I think at the heart of it is the fact that as humans, and I'm sure there's loads of psychological research into this, we like to connect. We are so desperate to understand each other and what makes each other tick. And I know it's interesting, you talk about poetry, and poetry is a massive symbol of that. People have talked about things they can't articulate in any other way than through poetry for years and years. And there was a similar thing with Alan Turing and love letters. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and the history of that.
So Turing, when he gets his hand on an actual computer, he generates love letters. So that's a story. But even in his famous paper on artificial intelligence, before even kind of that anticipates the actual, computer capacity for intelligence, one of the first examples that he gives of like the intelligence test of the Turing test is a computer who writes poetry, and a computer who then has to defend his poetry in front of a critic. But sorry, I'm like totally. I want to come back to Alice's question as well. I think that's a good moment. So you said poetry, Kate, and Alice was asking kind of what's the one big idea here. But what fundamentally what poetry means, like we imagine computers to write poetry, that's kind of our poetry. We imagine their creativity to kind of be similar to our creativity. And you can make computers simulate a poem, right? Simulate a human poem. Turing's test is a test of, can a computer simulate a human being in some way through conversation? And the answer, yes, it can. A computer can write kind of a cool poem that you'll be like, oh, wow, that's a weird little poem. But fundamentally, true computer poetry is an absolutely alien kind of thing. Like imagine if computers were to write poetry for other computers, they would look nothing like the poetry that we know of, right? If computers were to write short stories or whatever it is, computer creativity is an utterly alien kind of idea. And so the question is not whether they can write poetry or whether they are creative. The question is, what would it even be for a computer to be creative? What is this kind of other, strange, weird formation that we could call computer literature? Like what would it mean for a computer to create art? And I strongly suspect that art for a computer of any kind, visual art or verbal art, will just be something completely different. And we are watching it emerge in front of us. And we're like, maybe it will look like our stuff. We're trying to make analogies with human, right, output, but it's not.
Definitely. I mean, that's so interesting you mentioned that. And I suppose looking forward to the future, what are you excited about with AI in literature?
Looking forward, I'm very much I'm a historian in a sense, and a lot of my projects are looking backward. So I don't often like to prognosticate about the future. So a lot of my work has to do with unearthing a particular history of computing that turns out that history has a lot to do with literature and with literary theory. And I gave you a few examples of how from early algorithms, early computers, early kind of people who were involved in computing and even pre-computing, just various ways in which we automate thinking had to do with automating language production. And there is a deep history there at the intersection of computer science and literary theory My work is a lot about unearthing that history and kind of showing, when you look at your phone, when you use Gmail or something to autocomplete your sentence, I want sort of my audience to think back. It's not something that happened like in the last 10 years or something. I want my audience to like think back and reflect on the centuries of technology that makes that particular thing possible.
So if I was to flip that question, and if I was to ask again about historically, what do you admire in the past that perhaps we have now lost?
When you study technology in its development, early experiments in technology seem kind of so experimental and so involved, and so sort of they involve humans in a very interesting way. So like I said, you see this, Majorcan medieval monk playing with words and sort of right getting, you can imagine him, talking to his monk friends and using these kind of toys and experimenting and playing and having that right sense of exploration. Whereas with time, I think when technologies become embedded in the political world, in the corporate world, in the economic world, they also begin to be less experimental, and they become more opaque, right? So most of us today, we don't know, like when Gmail auto completes your sentence, you don't really see what's happening under the hood, right? Like the more advanced the technology is, the more it looks like magic to us, right? And we lose a sense of what's under the hood, that we lose the wonderment. So we lose the wonder, but we also lose agency, right? So I am concerned that as we're implementing these automated processes into our lives, I'd like us to retain, well, we need to know how they work. We need to know, do they hold implicit biases? If you train a machine to write poetry, but you're the underlying poetry is racist or something like that, well, the machine will replicate those biases, right? And if you don't know how the machine works, if you don't know what algorithms you're actually implementing, if you don't know how the technology, I mean like we collectively, right? So the algorithms, the machines, artificial intelligence has an impact on our lives, but the more complicated it gets, the less we sort of can think through its impacts, the less agency we have in sort of making a choice about using this technology or not. And that worries me.
I really feel like we are at such a turning point in our relationship with humans and technology in terms of autonomy, as we've kind of talked about. And I think it is so important that as we move forward, we almost keep an eye on it before it's too late. And we just thought to finish off, we would ask you some questions about you. We have to ask about your favorite book genre. Is it science fiction, or is it something completely different?
It's a difficult question because in a sense, I'm like a professional book reader, and I teach literature. Secretly, I grew up, not so secretly, but I come from the Soviet Union. I come from Moldova. I grew up reading Russian, and of course Russian literature was my first love, and Russian poetry was my first encounter with that world. And I often fall back on Russian literature for in my own kind of non-professional life.
And an age-old question: if you could take 3 books to a desert island, what would you pick? What would they be?
I would have to like spend a year thinking about that question, and I would be completely sort of arguing with myself for a long time before I could decide. But I guess one way to answer this is that I do teach at Columbia. I teach a course called Lit Hum, and in Lit Hum we read from Homer to Virginia Woolf to Hurston. We read kind of centuries and centuries worth of literature, and I teach that class. It's it more or less stays the same. I teach that class often, And that is in a way like being on an island. I read the same, those are the books I have actually ended up reading, multiple times. And I have to say, and I still love reading them. I still love coming back to them every year and like never being bored of those books. And I would probably, I'm guessing, my 3 books, if I had to choose 3, I would probably pick it from our curriculum in literature humanities.
And I have to ask, if you could take those books or a bot that would write you new books until the end of time, would you still choose the 3
amazing
books?
No, bot, no question. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, everybody else. No, because right, if you took a bot, it would just it would forever entertain you with new things. So if you had a generative mechanism, it would sort of be just by sheer volume, it would keep going. But yeah, I think I'll take a bot. Sorry, Homer.
I think he would have the same opinion if he was around now. I'd love to ask him.
Now, also, in my defense, a truly generative bot would occasionally exactly replicate Homer or Dostoevsky or Virginia Woolf just by accident. So I wouldn't be missing out either.
Completely. You've got the best of both. I think we've come up with a great solution.
Yeah, there you go.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Teens in AI podcast, and thank you so much to Dennis for speaking with us. Catch new episodes of the podcast every Thursday, where we'll be speaking to more leading figures in the field of AI. And as always, please continue to let us know your thoughts by getting in touch with us via social media on Instagram and Twitter @TeensInAI Pod. Thanks for listening.